Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo encounter horror stories. First story, Hunade by a Wendigo. I've posted this in the Wendigo community I'm in, but I also wanted to share this here to see if anyone else has any intel that can help me since the other community seems to be pretty quiet. I realize how unbelievable this story might be, but I assure you it's entirely true. I've had countless experiences with the supernatural since I was 4. I'm 33 now, but this is one of the most terrifying ones I've had. I've looked at some of the stories in this community to see if there's anything I haven't discovered yet. I thought that if I shared my encounter here, there might be someone who has some information that could help. Please don't comment if you don't believe in the supernatural. I've seen skeptics plastering their 2 cents on some posts. I'm looking for legitimate information. My questions are at the end of this. Thanks in advance. I had an experience with a Wendigo this fall in early October in northern Minnesota in a state forest very close to, if not on, a reservation. I've always heard that speaking of them can draw them to you, but I hadn't thought of or listened to any Wendigo stories any time close to my encounter. I was staying with some very dear friends. I'll call them M and C, and they have a camper in their yard by the lake for guests to sleep in. I had walked down to the camper from the house with my miniature dachshund, Ebony, around midnight and found that I needed to set some things up, primarily the heater. By the time I was done getting everything in order, it was approximately 1:30. I never thought to lock the door because, really, I figured it's in the middle of the woods, so there was nothing to worry about. I was wrong. I had closed the curtains, thank God. And I was having trouble falling asleep because my anxiety was going mad. M and C's dogs were barking outside, and their geese wouldn't stop honking. Ebony, who usually sleeps under the covers, was sitting on my hip while I laid on my side, and I could feel her turning her head back and forth, like she was trying to track something outside. I tried tucking her under the blankets to calm her down, but she kept returning to her perch on my hip. I have no idea how long I laid there. I would say at least 40 minutes, when all of a sudden I heard M's voice outside the camper. "Anybody in there?" And what sounded like claws dragged down the side of the camper. I almost called back to her when I realized number 1, she and C were both fast asleep by now, and number 2, M knew I was in there. She wouldn't ask if anybody was. Suddenly, I noticed everything had gone absolutely silent outside. The dogs and the birds had stopped carrying on. The gusts of wind had even stopped. It was the kind of silence you hear about in horror stories. How the woods go mute when something evil is in the area. Then another thought hit me. Ebony would be losing her *T and barking at the door if that had been anything human. She was frozen on my hip, dead quiet, shaking. I didn't dare to move, but I was really starting to have to pee. And I remembered that I hadn't locked the door. I have no idea how long I laid there debating whether I should get up and use the bathroom and lock the door, but it felt like an eternity. In reality, I guessed it was maybe 10 to 15 minutes. I thought it may have been a skinwalker at first, but remembered they don't mimic the voices of your loved ones to lure you into the woods. Wendigo do. I knew these creatures, demons, whatever they are, can lure humans out of their abodes if they make eye contact with you. And everything in me was screaming to make sure I didn't look outside. I made doubly sure I didn't look through any cracks in the curtains as I walked softly to the front of the camper, and very slowly turned the lock, praying and holding my breath. I made sure to keep my eyes away from the windows as I crawled back in bed and pulled Ebony close, and she finally stayed under the blankets. I snuck a peek at my phone for the time before I laid down, figuring it had to be close to 3 a.m., the witching hour. It was about 2:30. As soon as I laid down, the wind kicked back up and M and C's basset hounds erupted into howls as they came running down to the camper and a little ways into the trees, and the geese started their noise again. I heard the bassets come back to the camper, barking a few more times before they laid down outside the door to protect me. I didn't get out of bed again that night. I told M and C what had happened the next morning. I think I was hoping M would say she had come down to check on me and Ebony, but she confirmed what I already knew. They had gone to bed as soon as I had left the house. I said a prayer over their house, the camper, and all of us the following night and had an uneventful night. Thank God. I also spoke with another guy who's familiar with the supernatural to see if he knew any more about Wendigo. I'm not sure how accurate the information he gave me was, or if it's reliable at all, but when I asked him why Ebony hadn't made a peep, I had assumed it was because she was absolutely petrified. He said a Wendigo can control animals to keep them from alerting their owners about its presence. He also told me they can't enter houses that aren't made of wood directly from the forest they're hunting in, tents and campers included, because they consist of man-made materials too. A lock is useless. They can unlock and open a door so they can try to lure you outside. And 3. They typically stay in the woods, but they will come into a smaller town and never into a city. I had never heard of any of what he told me before, so again, I can't speak for accuracy, but I also haven't researched the claims either. He also advised me never to go outside to pee at night if I ever go camping, and to bring a bucket or something to use, and to make sure that I always close tent flaps and curtains before falling asleep. He said if the flaps are open so you can see outside, the Wendigo can make eye contact with you and draw you out. After leaving M and C's to go to my father's house for a few days, I had the distinct feeling of being watched when I took Ebony outside after dark. My father lives 3 hours away from M and C, but his house is in the country. I told myself it was only the fear from the experience and what I know about the Wendigo triggering an overactive imagination. I never heard anything, and I watched Ebony's behavior very closely, and she didn't act like she had in the camper. I'm moving back to that area from Canada, and this experience has been weighing heavily on my mind. I've been trying to find any information about warding them off, or if they have a home hunting range like cougars do, or if they move on from a region. My prayers did work the second night, so I figure I can pray over the property. I also have holy water that I can use, since the Wendigo is an evil spirit that possesses people or physically manifests. Frustratingly, a majority of what comes up in searches is utter garbage like Wikipedia. Does anyone know if a Wendigo stays in one area? Are my concerns about it coming back when I get moved into my cabin warranted? Or am I worrying excessively? Do you have any tips for warding them off? Second story. The Wendigo. It was their own fault. Everyone knows that you don't go camping on a reservation. There were 4 of them in the beginning, all of them males. They looked young. They were probably hoping for one last hurrah before heading off to college. One last chance to be kids, to say goodbye to what they mistakenly thought was their stomping ground. The first night had been a boring one for me. I'd stayed just outside of their campsite, where the firelight couldn't reach me. Then, I just watched. All night. I didn't move, barely breathed. The horns on my head were lost in the branches of the trees, and the deer hide around my waist were covered in burrs and thorns. The second night was more interesting. After the fire was all but glowing coals, and the campers had curled up in their sleeping bags, I strode into camp. My footsteps were quiet. They always were. Because of the mild night, all 4 were sleeping outside. One in particular caught my eye. There was nothing physically unusual about him. Dirty blonde, mild tan, maybe 6 feet tall, but I could tell that he was a perfect candidate. So I leaned in to whisper to him. My voice was soft, but powerful. He heard them whether he was awake or not. Then things went bad. One of the campers woke up, and he wasn't thrilled to find me in their campsite. He shouted, warning his friends. Monster. Abomination. Wendigo. I left. Quickly. I'm not one for company, you could say. I prefer the quiet places. Solitude. But it didn't matter. It was done. The next day, I resumed my watching. In their haste to flee the reservation, and particularly to flee me, they'd become lost. At night, while I crouched in the underbrush, I could hear them arguing with each other. But I kept a careful eye on the one I'd whispered to. He was my favorite, after all. The 4th day was the most interesting. It was what I most looked forward to, and I almost missed it. I found my hiding place just before it started. The camper, my favorite, the one I whispered to, was amazing. The way he used the axe made it seem like an art form. It was beautiful. It was bloody. Foul-smelling saliva dripped out of my maw, leaving slimy trails down my front. The smell of the meat, that wonderful meat, cooking was even better. I wanted to stay there, watching and smelling, forever, but I couldn't. The duct tape holding my horns on was coming loose. Not to mention that Susan was expecting me back before nightfall. It was our youngest's first day of school, after all. I mean, come on. You don't really believe in Wendigos, do you? Third story. Something followed me in the woods. Hello everyone. I have been an avid Reddit reader for about a year now. I always read r/no sleep, but I never posted anything myself because there wasn't much to say. That was until my encounter in the woods. I'm leaving my story here because I still want answers. I need answers. I need to know what the fuck is going on. Let me begin by saying I live in the South, so the woods was something I grew up with. I was always an outdoorsman and would often go climbing and exploring in the forests around where I lived. Sometimes I would go out to camp, chopping small trees, making fires, and practicing with my knives and machetes. I was never really scared of anything, to be honest, even at a young age. I always carried at least a fixed blade knife with me on my adventures and felt like I could take on anything that came my way. As I grew older, I didn't do this kind of thing as much, but I would go hiking quite often. Anyway, a couple of weeks ago on a Sunday, May 3rd, I decided I would go on an afternoon hike just to enjoy being outside. I still enjoyed the woods as much as I had when I was a kid. Now I think I actually appreciate it more. My senses are calibrated a lot better these days, so I am able to take in all the scenery and nature, which just feels peaceful. This Sunday seemed just like any other, and I got into my car to drive to my hiking spot. I'm not a fan of going on official hiking trails because the linear course and other people seem to dilute the wild. My spot is pretty out of the way, about an hour from my home, and no one else would have any reason to go there. It isn't marked at all. No signs, no fences, no footprints, nothing. It is just endless woods for miles and miles. I parked my car a pretty good distance from where I always entered, just in case anyone came by, although the dirt road was always completely deserted. Now that I think about it, I have never seen or even heard a car or other people over there. I set off on my walk through the woods, geared with my trail running shoes, a hat, and my 6-inch engraved knife in its sheath on my belt. I strolled along my normal route to start off with an expanse of lush green in all directions. I covered about 2 miles of flat ground, climbed a 20-foot boulder wall, and traversed across a small creek. I was just taking in everything around me. The cool breathe of a breeze on my back, the sound of the flowing water filling my ears, and scanning the diverse landscape for any wildlife. I continued on my favorite path. It wasn't really a path, but I knew the woods pretty well at this point. Then I got to an area where I realized I had never gone off to the left. I'm not sure why I never went that way because I had pretty much explored all other directions in the vicinity. Not taking too much time to think about it, I headed left into the uncharted horizon. After a few more miles in this new direction, I started to get a strange feeling. It was an eerie kind of feeling, like something was off. I realized I hadn't seen or any animals over this way. No birds flying above, no squirrels shuffling on tree branches, not even any bugs making noises. Nothing. I brushed it off and continued my trek. I stopped here and there to examine different things, like strange markings on some of the trees, but there was nothing too exciting over here. I noticed the sun was started to descend and the darkness was creeping in. I had completely lost track of time exploring this new place. I left my home to go on my hike a little after noon, so I had to have been out there for 5 or 6 hours. I remember thinking how strange it was that the moon was already fairly high so early in the day. Time seems to go by in a different manner when I am out in the woods. I don't know why that is. I decided it was time to head back. I would have to hurry because it would be dark soon. I turned and set off in the direction I had come from. At least I thought I was. The woods were a lot denser in this section than the others I had explored in the opposite direction, so it was a lot harder to keep track of where I was. I soon realized I was kind of lost. I must have gotten turned around somewhere. Whenever I am in the woods, even an area I know well, I always leave a trail of some kind to guide me back. Every 30 feet or so I would bend a branch, or occasionally make an X on a tree with my knife, so it was clear I had been there. I kept trying to trace my steps, but I couldn't find any broken branches and I was getting a bit frustrated. I never made mistakes like this, so what the hell was going on? Just then I saw an X marked on a tree. Ah, there we go. No need to get worked up after all. I walked further looking for more signs. Then I saw another X. Then another. And another. All right, I definitely didn't carve that many trees, and there were still no broken branches at all. I was getting a little worried at this point. I continued on, hoping to see some form of familiarity, but I just kept seeing X markings. They were on almost every tree at this point. Now I know I had never been this far onto this side before, so these markings couldn't have been from me on previous visits. Plus, I would never be so foolish to make that many markings because it would just create confusion. I went to examine one of the markings and quickly realized that they were wider than my knife would cut, and a lot deeper. That's when the feeling hit me again. That eerie sense when you know something is wrong. That feeling that you're not alone. That feeling that you're being watched. Now, like I said, I have always been pretty fearless, but I'm not stupid. There are certain situations that even a knife and good instincts can't get you out of. Still, I was determined not to show fear. Maybe if I showed whoever was fucking with me that I wasn't going to take any shit, that they would show themselves or leave. The dark was getting thicker by the minute. I needed to get the fuck out of here now. I started walking slowly in what I thought was the right direction, listening for anything abnormal. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At one point I finally thought I was just being paranoid and making shit up. Then I started to hear noises, all while the consuming darkness swept over the forest. The sound started off like small sticks breaking, then scratching of tree bark, then leaves rustling violently, then branches being torn off trees. I looked in every direction, but it was getting harder and harder to see with night looming down fast and my eyes unadjusted. My hand gripped the hilt of my knife tight, and I started moving a faster pace. I was getting really freaked out. The next sound came much louder than all the rest. It sounded closer. I turned to where it was coming from. That's when I saw him. I could barely make out a dark figure off in the distance. The moonlight was beaming down. It was one of the brightest moons I have ever seen. It still provided an illumination through the thick canopy of trees overhead. This guy looked big. Like really big. There was no way I could take a guy that big normally. With a knife, I maybe stood a chance. That is if he wasn't armed with anything. I could see him start walking in my direction, getting closer and closer. Then I noticed that he walked in a very strange way, and I couldn't see any outline of clothing. He was covered in something. As he moved closer, I realized just how big it was. There is no way a man can be that big. There aren't any big game in the area I live. The biggest things we have are deer and coyotes. This thing looked like the size of a bear, but I knew that was impossible. Bears didn't live anywhere near here, like not even in this state. I started walking backwards, drawing my knife slowly, not wanting to take my eyes off of this thing. Just as I pulled my knife fully from the sheath, it started running full speed. On all fours. I have never run so fast in my entire life. Within seconds my hat was off my head, falling behind me carelessly. My legs were in overdrive as I sprinted in the opposite direction of whatever animal was chasing me. I wasn't going to stop. There is no fucking way I am going to stop, I told myself. I could hear it behind me, gaining on me with tremendous speed. I was too terrified to look over my shoulder, but I could feel it right on my heels. I started weaving through the trees, still going at full speed. This seemed to throw it off a little, like it didn't expect a good old-fashioned serpentine pattern. I felt it get a little further behind me and continued to dodge and weave through the branches and trees. The sound of branches snapping with ease was the only audible noise in my mind. I still thought I might be able to lose it. That was until I reached a clearing where the small creek stretched through the woods. Open area. Fuck. I at least knew where I was now. I tore through the last of the trees and was making my way to the creek. The creek was pretty wide here, but there were some rocks dividing the water into different streams. I leapt to one rock and then to another. It was too dark to see clearly, and I was moving so fast that I didn't have time to check my surroundings appropriately. As my foot hit the second rock, I felt it slide out from under me. It felt like I was falling in slow motion, and I could clearly hear the beast right behind me. I caught myself with my free arm, but still went face first into the water. Without a second's hesitation, I hurled myself back up and jumped out of the creek, all in one fluid motion. I honestly wasn't sure I was going to make it at this point. I could hear intense grunts and growls right on my ass as I tried to start running again. Suddenly, I couldn't go forward. Something pulled me back by my ankle. I had almost forgotten the knife clutched like a dagger in my right hand. It was like an extension of my body at this point. I spun on pure instinct as the immense force pulled me back and tried to slash with my blade. I must have hit because my knife didn't come back as I swung my body in the other direction when the grip on my ankle released. Then I heard the most terrifying cry, sounding like nothing I had ever heard before. It cracked through the silence of the forest, creating a void of pure terror. I said I ran faster than I ever had before, but that is not true. In this moment, I ran faster than humanly possible. I guess it was that fight or flight response people always talk about. I didn't look back once as the foul cries filled the air. I just ran. After what seemed like hours, I finally saw the break in the tree line where the dirt road was. I sprinted on fumes to my car, grabbed the keys from the back tire, and took off. As I drove off, I could still hear cries and howls in the distance, but nothing else. When I had twisted my body to strike at the creature, I got a glimpse of it fully. It was not a fucking bear. It was not a fucking coyote. I don't know what the fuck it was. I had never seen eyes like that. I had never seen teeth like that. The image pulsed through my mind all the way home, but I made it. I made it out alive. I survived. When I got home, I took some time to compose myself. Sure, I was safe. I needed a hot shower to clean off and soothe my terrified mind. It wasn't until I got out of the shower that I noticed the long, deep gash on the back of my calf. Maybe I nicked it on something as I was running. The adrenaline had kept the pain at bay, I guess. I quickly cleaned it and bandaged it. I took some sleeping pills that night because I knew there was no way I was going to fall asleep on my own. The most bizarre thing is that when I woke up the next day and removed my bandage, there was no wound. It was a completely healed scar, just a faint line of the large cut I had seen the night before. I still don't understand how that is possible. Ever since that night, I felt strange. I haven't felt like myself, and it gets worse every day. It doesn't feel like a sickness. Hell, I feel stronger than ever. It just feels like I'm not fully in control. All I know is that I can never go back to that spot. I still feel like I hear that howl every night in my dreams, but it has to be just a dream, right? Fourth story. Monster in the forest. Things aren't going too well for my wife or I. I'm 27 and I've been a construction worker ever since I was 18. Up until a while ago, I had no trouble staying employed since I started working in '04. I was fortunate to be part of a company that was able to survive the poor economy over the past couple years, at least up until now. Due to some lawsuits, my company went bankrupt. I lost my job, and I was working under the table for so long, so I don't get unemployment. I was worried. As a man, I had to provide for my family. My wife and I have 2 children that we need to take care of. She works retail, but doesn't make enough money to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. I immediately began to look for another job, but I have no education, so it wasn't easy. I browsed Craigslist. I was willing to do anything. Construction, yard work, physical labor, transportation. I own a pickup. Security. I'm a pretty big guy, built like a football player, you name it. I'd occasionally get the odd job or two, but I had trouble keeping my head above water. That is, until I saw a job offer on Craigslist. Weekly physical labor needed, city redacted, earn $1,000+ a week heavy labor. Call, name redacted, ad, number redacted. I figured it was some sort of scam, but I was desperate. I called the number and inquired about the job. A man answered the phone. He explained that he owned a large plot of land just outside of town, and he needed someone to come dig holes. You could tell from his voice that he was no young man, which is probably why he couldn't just dig the holes himself. I asked a few more questions. How big are these holes? Why does he want them? How long does he expect digging one will take? Etc. He explained that there was a monster in the forest at night, and the holes were to be dug in the forest, then converted to booby traps in order to catch this monster. He needed as many holes as possible. They needed to be approximately 9 feet deep and 4 feet by 4 feet across, although I may need to make them wider so I have more room to dig. He explained that the soil was hard, so each hole would take at least 3 days to dig, and I couldn't use heavy machinery inside the forest without damaging trees and had to break through tree roots with a shovel. It was clear I was talking to a mentally ill man. I mean, you could tell he was old by his voice. He must have had dementia or schizophrenia or something like that. I just want to make it clear that there is no way he was sane whatsoever. Monsters don't exist, and he was probably going to hurt himself by falling into one of these booby traps. I'm pretty sure booby trapping your property is illegal anyway. Despite this, I needed the money. I didn't care how hard I'd have to work or what I'd have to do, as long as I didn't hurt anyone innocent. I was willing to do it to provide for my family. I agreed to help him on the condition that he pays me, in cash, every single day before I did any work. I didn't want to get scammed or find out he was just some old man on Social Security, and he agreed. My first day of work was the very next day. I drove out to his property and went up to knock on the door. I saw an envelope taped to the door with my name on it. Inside the envelope was $333.33 and a note explaining that he's not home right now, but his shed is unlocked and I can use any tools. He told me to dig the first hole deep in the forest. Now, this forest was nothing like I imagined. I imagined a thick grove of trees on someone's property, but this forest was almost a square mile of jungle. You couldn't see more than 5 or 10 feet in front of you because of the dense foliage obstructing your view. I walked about 10 minutes into the center of the forest and found a good spot for a hole. He was right. The soil was hard for the first foot. It took all my strength to move just one small shovel of it. I spent a good 10 hours digging that day. I only stopped once for a quick lunch break. I had brought 4 gallons of water with me into that forest. I called it a day after I had drank the final one. I was exhausted and could barely move, but I had just made over $300. That's $30 an hour, more than I was making at my construction job. That's enough money to buy a month of groceries for us if we get lucky. It was tough, but I was providing for my family. I made it home, took a bath, and went asleep. I got a good night's sleep and was back to the old man's house by 6 a.m. the very next day. I again went up to the door to meet him, but there was another envelope. In it, there was another $666.67 and a note. I was just getting home as you were leaving yesterday. I tried to get your attention, but I failed. I saw your hole and you're making good progress. If you do as much today as you did yesterday, you'll be done. I grabbed the money and went digging. 12 hours that day. It took 22 hours altogether, but I had finished the hole and made $1,000. Now I could pay rent this month, too. I took 2 days off from digging. My body ached and I had to stay home all day. I figured that with practice, I could routinely dig 2 holes a week. He said he wants as many as possible, so if he could afford to give me $2,000 a week, that'd be great. My wife and I could finally pay our medical debt and save some money for when the old man doesn't need more holes. This went on for over a month. He was never home. He'd just leave money and instructions as to where he wanted the next hole. I'd go in and start digging at 6 a.m., then leave by 5 p.m. so I could eat dinner with my kids. My body was being worn out, but it provided a necessary income. It took me 18 hours to dig a hole, 2 days' work. I'd go and look over the past holes I dug, occasionally, to make sure he wasn't burying human bodies or anything. He wasn't. He wasn't even converting them to booby traps. Some holes caved in, others held their shape, but for the most part, they were just how I'd left them. Who knows why I was digging holes? Maybe he was trying to recreate that book, Holes, where they're looking for treasure in the desert. One day when I got to his property, there was more than one envelope on the door. I opened and read the second one and realized the old man hired another laborer, another hole digger. In my letter, he told me he needed 120 more holes altogether. 120. I'd have worked for a long time, even if someone else started to help. I waited for and talked to this second guy. He seemed like a nice guy. He was older than me by a good 20 years, but he was in a similar position as me. He used to work in the automobile industry and was recently fired. He needs a roof and food too, and thought this job sounded too good to be true, but he was willing to take that risk. Soon thereafter, my wife was diagnosed with cancer. We were dropped from our insurance and most of the money I was making, which was a lot of money, went to medical bills. The months went on. 120 holes became 100, and 100 became 50. We were okay at that point, but I was worried about what would happen after I no longer was needed to dig holes. One day I finished my hole early. As I was walking away, I noticed my friend digging his hole. He was almost done, 5 feet wide, 9 feet deep. I grabbed his ladder and walked away. 2 weeks later, I filled in his hole. The old man is right. There is a monster in the forest. He's still insane, for believing a monster will be caught by its own booby trap. Fifth story. The feral forest. I have seen the ice sheets in the Antarctic and the sand dunes in the Sahara. I saw the curve of the world as I floated in zero gravity, and I felt the crushing weight of the sea 400 feet beneath the waves as I explored unknown wrecks. 3 ex-wives, 8 recognized children, and none of them deserve the fortune I have accumulated. And yet eagerly they wait, because they've heard the rumors. I hear the whispers in the halls beneath my office. Murmurs of cancer, the bad kind, the type of cancer that you don't survive. It's true, non-small cell lung cancer is the biggest killer in the USA, and I just found out that I've got it. When I was 20 years old, my father got me working for him in our family grocery shop, Walker & Sons. He was ecstatic. The shop was started by my grandfather and bared the family name, and my father was ready to hand me the lead. In a single day, I saw a demand that we could barely supply, and as I flipped the door sign to closed, I asked my father why he'd never bothered to expand. "This shop isn't about the money," he'd stated, hunched over a dustpan and brush. "Pop built this store with his own hands so that he could support and raise a family. Money can buy you a lot of things, but it won't buy you happiness, it won't buy you love, and it can't buy you good heart." He stood up and arched his back, clearly in pain. 7 years later, when the 25th Walker & Sons supermarket opened, I was on my yacht with a group of entrepreneurs and philanthropists that had become my friends. I had proved my father wrong for the first time. When I was in my mid-30s, supermarkets were just a small drop in an ocean of investments, startups, and ventures. I was one of the super rich, the top 1% of the top 1%. By that time, I could promise you that there was at least one item in any room, almost anywhere in the USA, that my companies had some part of manufacturing, designing, or constructing. That's when I met Hannah and found a love with a price that would prove my father wrong a second time. I nearly lost myself back then. Hannah spent her time looking after my first 2 children while I got high on whatever I could get my hands on. Meanwhile, the money kept us together. She was happy as long as she had a credit card without a limit. Thousands were spent on designer shoes and clothes. Tens of thousands were spent on nannies. Eventually, even the money couldn't replace what she really needed: a loving husband. She cost me millions of dollars in settlements, and I can guarantee you she isn't seeing another cent from me. I won't bother going into my other ex-wives or children. Let's just say that it was a mistake to marry and a mistake to breed. I never could keep my eye away from a pretty young thing. It was in the haze of my 30s that, unbeknownst to me, I would give myself this incredible opportunity. I didn't really care at the time. To me, I remember seeing it as a chance to play God, and that's something I was never going to turn down. At this point in my life, it was rare for me to have a day of sobriety, and when I did get past the hangover, I wasn't of much use to anyone. The letter had been sat on my desk for a couple of weeks before I got around to opening it. It had managed to stay at the top of the pile because the man that had delivered it to me had been stubborn enough to insist it was to be hand-delivered by him. He waited outside for nearly 5 hours. When he was finally sent up to see me, he simply handed me the letter and left. The contents described a project unlike anything I'd ever heard of. It asked for a hefty amount of money just to begin, and then an annual sum to cover the costs of staffing and research and development. I couldn't give it to them fast enough. I secured myself a line with the head of operations, Mark Young, and told him I was always on the other line. Mark purchased a vast amount of lush forest land, in an area I won't disclose, under his own name with an account funded by me. He erected a wall around the perimeter and hired 24-hour surveillance. Not a single spot in or around the forest was unseen at any time. With that, and a tree canopy thick enough to avoid any potential satellites snooping on us, we were safe. A building large enough to be a small town was constructed. It had a food mall, a hairdresser, a small hospital, staff living quarters, and everything the workers would need in their new home, for however long their contract was for. Mark's plan could never have come to fruition without me, so I owned him. Between ourselves, we called it the forest. In public, we didn't talk about it at all. No one did. The staff were looked after as long as they didn't ask any questions. We tried our best to keep the sections separate, and in general, everyone was happy to keep their knowledge to themselves. Our first step was to buy the orphans. We purchased 25 healthy baby boys and girls from different orphanages of different ethnicities and countries. We raised them without language, without education, without love. Once they could walk, they were taken from the nursery and placed into the nest. The nest was designed to introduce the subjects to the world. It was a simple 3-walled room with a ceiling to keep them dry, and a small outside area enclosed by a simple chain-link fence to keep away any animals. There was nothing in the nest except for grass and mud. We didn't clothe the subjects or give them beds. Mark wanted to know what a real human was like. Each morning and night, a siren would wail. From a hatch in one of the walls, we would drop cooked meats. As the children grew older, they began to fight for the food, scratching, pushing, and pulling at hair. Nothing was against the rules when food was involved. Once they were 5, male subject 6 wandered up to the fence and put his face against the wire. His body was already marked with scars and bruised from that day's fighting. Without much hesitation, he clambered up the wire frame and dropped down the other side. From that moment, the subjects were free to roam the forest. As puberty set in, the forest became a difficult place for the girls, and consequently, the boys. Under the circumstances, it was difficult to say if consensuality was something we could ever consider. These were humans, but they did not have a language beyond grunts and shouts. They did not have law that permitted or denied certain acts. Everything was natural. This was the first time we saw something that divided the pack. Suddenly, the boys were no longer happy in each other's company. With sex came ownership, and with ownership came an unwillingness to share. The biggest of the boys were also the first to hit puberty. Male subjects 1 and 12 each took control of a large proportion of the girls. Left over was the majority of the boys and a couple of immature girls, who unfortunately suffered for the next few months until they were allowed into one of the tribes. Food became a battle between the men. 3 male subjects were killed in as many months. Another simply died from starvation. However, when male subject 7 reached the brink of hunger, he warily approached the tribe of male subject 1. On his knees, the nearly man crawled up towards the clan resting beneath a large tree. Subject 1 was alert, watching with wide eyes as he approached. As the boy got even closer, Subject 1 stood and marched over. The girls were getting restless. As the boy got even closer, Subject 1 stood and marched over. The girls were getting restless. The boy stopped moving and shielded his face with his hands, peering through the cracks in his fingers. In a moment where the choice was violence or sympathy, this was the first time a subject had shown sympathy. Subject 1 nuzzled the boy away with his foot, pushing him from the group. 7 was too weak to even crawl away and fell to his side. He died the following day. It was during this time, when the feral children were nearly 15, that I decided to enter the forest. Mark had argued with me furiously right up until I'd told him I'd pull the plug on the funding to his project if he didn't let me in. He let me join the group with a scowl and insisted I was as accurate in mimicking their condition as possible. In his words, they should have no reason to believe I hadn't been living there for my entire life. And so, Mark Young watched as his 40-something billionaire investor took to the forest stark naked and eager to begin. I sauntered up to 12's tribe with my hands swinging by my sides. The boy shot up to me, screaming and hollering in my face, trying to push me away from the girls. I'd seen him do this to the other boys, and usually it worked. I tackled him to the ground and punched until he was spitting blood and barely moving. Dominance was key. The tribe became mine, and I took 7 girls from the boy I left wheezing on the grass. He stumbled away from us, back toward the other boys that had been confined to their own company in more recent times. My girls were beautiful. They were young, fit, athletic, and the sex was incredible. It was so primal and instinctive. I've honestly never had such insatiable urges, not even the drugs compared to it. Quite frankly, I'd never been happier. Over the course of a few weeks, I gave them names that suited their faces. I learned each of their quirks. I stood my ground against any of the boys that tried to take my throne. I got in fights to win my tribe our food, and I never spoke a word. I was only planning on spending a couple of days in the forest, but I stayed for 4 months. Once I finally left the forest, I never really managed to fit back into the real world. My mind kept drifting back to my girls. My third wife was nothing compared to them. My kids were screw-ups. My businesses all but ran themselves, and the world outside of the confines of that forest was lackluster and meaningless. When Mark gave me the call nearly 5 months later, I felt a happiness I hadn't felt since I was in the forest. 3 of my girls were showing signs of pregnancy. 3. I gave my wife whatever she needed in order to have her sign for a divorce and flew to the forest. I watched them on the cameras. They were beautiful, flawless, even. 12 had reclaimed the group, and I felt rage building inside me as I saw him laying with my girls. I nearly threw up when I saw him sleeping with them, 2 heads nestled into his neck. It should have been me. It should always have been me. I stormed back into the forest with fire in my eyes. The boy was alerted to my presence by the frightened noises the girls made as they scampered behind the trees for cover. I would never hurt them. 12 was a bit bigger than when we last met, but not by much. Not by enough. I think I broke one of his arms because he ran off into the forest whimpering with it held to his chest. I took no time asserting my dominance with the girls. It was good to be back. The world was perfect again. 2 of the children survived. Once the first was born, Mark and I agreed that more food was needed to be dropped to feed the increasing population. The other tribe also had 2 babies, and it was important for us all that our girls were getting enough to live. Male subject 1 and I had come to an amicable, unspoken agreement that we would each take half of the food that was dropped. The other boys scavenged what we left behind. Every 6 months I had a checkup with the doctor in the building attached to the nest, and after a few years I stopped talking altogether. My companies continued to profit, my children did not care for me, or I for them, and I truly needed nothing more in the world. Today I had my biannual checkup with the doctor. I've been living in the forest continuously for 17 years. The sounds of the city drive me crazy. All of the engines and horns and shouting and bright lights all through the day combine with the foul air and make my head spin. The screen on this computer is hurting my eyes, and it takes me forever to find the right key. Mark is still watching me every day. He says he might join me next year, when he retires. The doctor flew in a specialist who confirmed the cancer in my lung and was told not to ask any questions. What's funny is that, even now, I have the chance to prove my father wrong for a third and final time. My father said money can't buy a good heart, but it can buy a good lung from a willing donor. The truth is, my sons have begun to best me in the forest. I do not have much time left with my girls before a new king heads the pride. If I do get a transplant, I must either go back to the real world, or live out my days shunned from my own tribe, which I cannot bear to do. I'm sorry, Mark, but it looks like you'll be going in alone. I have seen the ice sheets in the Antarctic and the sand dunes in the Sahara. I saw the curve of the world as I floated in zero gravity, and I felt the crushing weight of the sea 400 feet beneath the waves as I explored unknown wrecks. 3 ex-wives, 8 recognized children, and none of them deserve the fortune I have accumulated. But 13 girls, 15 children, and 9 grandchildren, along with an entire forest of people, true people, deserve every cent I have ever earned and ever will earn. When I die, all of my savings and subsequent earnings will go directly to the forest, to provide space to expand and grow. Thanks for the ride. Jonathan M. Walker. 6th story. I found a house buried in the woods. I'm sort of a nature guy. I say sort of because I'm not a nature guy, but I spend a considerable amount of time outside. It's mostly downloading music and going for hikes in my area, that sort of nature guy. That is why I consider myself fortunate that my backyard borders miles of forest. This is fortunate because I live in a very suburban area where most people are rationed only a few feet of neatly groomed yard. My backyard isn't large, but once I cross the threshold of brush and trees, I'm met with unearthed stones that create mock canyons. I get to walk along skinny, running creeks of water. Some of the rock formations are so colossal the area where the rock meets the soil juts up and forms overhangs that I can sit under to get out of the heat. It really is a gift to have all of this behind my house. I had never had a reason to feel anything but serenity out there, but as of a few months ago that serenity has taken on the guise of uneasy anticipation that something horrible happened out there. About 3 months ago, I went as deep into the woods as I had ever gone. I probably made my way through the trailless woods for about 3 hours. I was following a creek that was a stone or 2 away from being dammed up, but it muscled on anyway when something caught my attention. There was the base of a man-made stone structure. I went over to investigate. The structure was a dark gray rock that had patches of green moss running up it. I thought to myself that it must have been an old fire pit or maybe a well of sorts, but what the hell did I know? There was no one around for miles, so the structure had to be really old. I was about to keep on following the creek when it clicked with me. The structure was a chimney, the top of a chimney. At first I was in disbelief. There was no way it could be that. I started to dig away at the base of the chimney, and it kept on revealing more and more chimney no matter how much dirt I moved away. I eventually got down on my knees and started moving the dirt away using a nearby rock to break it up. I went on, strangely invested in seeing its end when I struck roof shingles. Yes, a few inches below the dirt were the roof shingles. I didn't know whether to think it was cool or terrifying. I hadn't decided yet. I did know that I was going to come back with some towels and move more dirt away, because at the time I hadn't been completely freaked. The next weekend I hiked back out to the house. The house had been on my mind almost obsessively. I made my way out with a newly bought pickaxe and a shovel from my garage. After a pretty rough few hours, I made it to the house. I was able to remember its location using the creek as a guiding reference. For the rest of the day I dug at the ground at a grueling pace, yet sure enough a full-size roof was being revealed. When I had just enough time to make it back before sundown, I decided to go back home, but I left the tools propped up on the chimney. I was exhausted and drinking some water I had brought when I noticed how eerily quiet everything was. No animal chatter, no wind, just the persistent trickle of the creek. No, there was one more sound. It was muffled, but I followed it. It was a radio, and it was coming from the house. I pressed up against the roof and listened hard. The hum of a radio could be heard inside the house. Someone had to be living inside the house. I suddenly felt a sense of dread. I felt a sense of being miles from home and potentially not alone. I left immediately and made a leg-numbing trek back to my house. About 2 months later, I went back one last time. Curiosity got the best of me, and I wish I could say that I was smart and forgot about it. But come on, could you forget about this? I made it out to the house. It was the exact same way I'd left it, tools and all. There was no radio playing, though. I had gone out there early, so I had time. I got to work on digging out the roof. I dug a pathway to the edge of where I thought the roof would be so I could dig down the side of the house. Relatively quickly, I made it to the edge and began down. I worked fervently and with great focus until I had about an inch of window exposed. I stuck my head into the hole to press up against the tiny sliver of the window, but I couldn't make out anything. I dug for nearly an hour more until I had the window almost completely exposed. I pushed up on the window, and to my surprise it slid open with ease as if it were new. The earth I was laying in fell away, and I tumbled down into the house. It was dark, but my eyes were adjusting. I sat up. The light outside illuminated the room a bit, and to my shock the whole house was completely furnished and seemed like it was lived in and managed. The room I was in must have been a guest room. It was decorated in a very 2000s era fashion. Somehow the house had airflow too, and with my eyes now adjusted, I made my way to the bedroom door. I grabbed the knob and slowly turned it. The door didn't even creak as I peeked into the hallway. I couldn't see much, but I heard something. This time it wasn't a radio. It was someone crying. The hallway had an off-white colored carpet flooring and a wooden staircase that led to the presumed first floor. Down the stairs, I could hear the gentle cries of a woman. I froze up. I wanted to call out for her, but I knew I had crossed a personal boundary of mine hours ago when I decided to come out here. I must have been locked up for a minute or so when a new sound was born, footsteps, and they were coming up the stairs fast. I quickly shut the door and made a hard turn towards the window. I scrambled anxiously up the dirt mound that had let itself into the room through the window. Whatever was coming after me had opened the door and was gaining on me, but did not make a sound besides the heavy footsteps. I got out the window and slid it shut right as something pounded up against it. The whole time the woman downstairs never stopped crying. I didn't stop. I climbed out of the hole and tore off through the woods. The whole way back I felt followed by a sense of hopelessness and dread. I don't remember much from the run back, but when I got home I passed out on my couch. I woke up a few hours later, and the sun had set. I locked all of my doors and window, scared that thing from the house would follow me, and then took a shower. As of now, nothing more has come of the house. I did call the police and reported the incident about a week ago, so I expect to hopefully hear from them soon. The uneasiness of my experience with that house has kept me out of those woods for good. In fact, I have kind of taken a hiatus on hiking alone. If there are ever updates, I can let you all know, but for now that is everything.